Was chivalry ever truly about rescuing damsels, or simply rearranging power dynamics? The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Camelot, each drop a tiny, insistent question mark. Sir Palomides, a man sculpted from granite and regret, stared out at the flooded courtyard, the reflection of his own grim face swirling in the murky water. He'd spent decades chasing shadows, glittering with the false promise of victory, only to find himself tangled in a web of impossible demands and shifting loyalties. It wasn't glory he sought, not anymore. It was something else. Something colder, sharper, like the edge of his sword. Let's rewind. Imagine a lady exquisite beyond measure, a jewel of a woman named Epinogrus. She wasn't just beautiful, she possessed a fierce, unsettling stillness, a quiet power that drew men to her like moths to a flame. Then came the nights, a chaotic parade of boasts and bluster, each vying for her attention, each eager to prove their worth. Epinogrus, bored with the predictable rituals of courtly love, simply chose. She selected Sir Epinogrus not for his prowess, but for a strange, unsettling intensity in his gaze. A battle erupted, a whirlwind of steel and fury, and Epinogrus emerged victorious, claiming her prize, but the victory was a poisoned chalice. Suddenly, a dozen other knights, each convinced of their own right, descended upon the scene, each demanding a turn with the lady. Palomides, a master swordsman renowned for his ruthless efficiency, stepped forward. He didn't offer flowers or sonnets, he offered a challenge. "Thou wentest, Sir Knit, to have that lady away fro me so litly," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "Thou shalt win her more dare than ever did I." The fight was brutal, a savage ballet of flashing steel. Palomides, fueled by a simmering frustration and a dark, unsettling satisfaction, cleaved through his opponents with chilling precision. He wasn't seeking honor, he was dismantling egos, reducing them to scattered fragments of armor and shattered pride. And when the dust settled, he stood triumphant, the victor, the possessor, but the victory felt hollow. He returned the lady to Epinogrus, a gesture that seemed less like chivalry and more like a calculated move. Epinogrus, a woman who had traded her entire world for this single, devastating battle, looked at him with an expression that wasn't gratitude, but something akin to profound sadness. "Alas, that ever I knew him other he me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "For I have for his sake lost my worship and also his life, that grieveth me most of all." It wasn't about love, not really. It was about the brutal, undeniable fact that Epinogrus had valued her own life and her own carefully constructed world above the fleeting adoration of a knight. A chilling realization for Palomides, who'd been chasing the phantom of a woman's heart for years. Now, a new challenge arose. Sir Isoud, a woman of fierce beauty and even fiercer will, found herself caught in a web of political intrigue and desperate pleas. King Mark, a man whose vanity outweighed his judgment, demanded her hand in marriage, a move that sent shockwaves through the court. Palomides, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to prove his worth, to demonstrate his skill, to acquire. He approached Isoud with a proposition, a carefully crafted bargain. Suddenly unavised, he stated, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light, "I wool that ye weet that I will have you a queen to lead here and to govern her whereas me list." He didn't promise affection, not exactly. He offered something far more valuable, a swift, decisive solution to a potentially explosive situation. Isoud, a woman who understood the precariousness of her position, agreed. She offered Palomides her promise, a simple, seemingly innocuous agreement, and he, in turn, demanded her as a prize. The king, predictably, was furious, but his protests were drowned out by the weight of Palomides' guarantee. "Madame," he declared, his voice laced with venom, grudge, "nat to go with me, for I desire nothing but your own promise." The scene was unsettling, a bizarre dance of power and manipulation. Palomides hadn't rescued Isoud, he'd seized her, reduced her to a pawn in his elaborate game. He'd become, in effect, her fifth possessor, a title that tasted faintly of ash in his mouth. But then, something unexpected happened. Palomides returned Isoud to Epinogrus, a gesture that defied logic, that seemed to mock the entire premise of his quest. He surrendered his claim, effectively dismantling his own carefully constructed narrative. Why? Because he'd realized that victory wasn't about ownership, not really. It was about something else. This wasn't a knightly act of generosity. It was a calculated maneuver, a strategic retreat. Palomides had observed the shifting dynamics of the court, the subtle power plays, the desperate attempts to control the narrative. He'd witnessed Epinogrus's quiet defiance, her refusal to be defined by anyone's expectations. And he'd understood that true power lay not in possession, but in the ability to relinquish control. The tale of the Grail quest offered a different kind of darkness, a chilling exploration of desire and temptation. The knights, driven by a desperate need for spiritual purity, embarked on a perilous journey to retrieve the Holy Grail. But the path to salvation was paved with deception and moral compromise. Imagine a barren landscape stripped bare of color and life, a desolate wasteland dominated by crumbling ruins and unsettling symbols. This was the realm of the Grail quest, a place where the line between reality and illusion blurred, where the devil himself manifested as seductive whispers and terrifying visions. Galahad, a figure of almost ethereal purity, led the charge, his every action imbued with a sense of sacred purpose. But the other knights, Percival, Bors, and Launcelot, were plagued by doubts, by temptations that threatened to derail their quest. They faced monstrous adversaries, not of steel and blood, but of the mind and the soul. Percival, a knight haunted by his past failures, found himself trapped in a desolate mountain, confronted by a beautiful woman who offered him solace and distraction. "Saint Mary, succor your maid," he cried out, his voice echoing through the barren landscape. But the woman was a trickster, a manifestation of the devil, designed to lure him from his path. The scene was eerily familiar, a distorted echo of the abduction narratives that permeated the earlier books. But here, the emphasis wasn't on physical possession, it was on the corruption of the soul. The woman's resistance wasn't a sign of defiance, it was a test of Percival's resolve, a desperate attempt to shatter his faith. And then there was Bors, a knight renowned for his unwavering loyalty and his selfless devotion to women. He faced a similar temptation, a false priest who offered him a chance to abandon his quest and embrace a life of sensual pleasure. "Have mercy on us all and suffer my lady to have here will," Bors declared, his voice filled with anguish. But he resisted, clinging to his vows of chastity, even as the seductive allure of the flesh threatened to overwhelm him. The Grail quest wasn't about rescuing damsels, it was about confronting the darkest impulses within oneself. It was a brutal, uncompromising examination of the human soul, stripped bare of all illusions. The strange thing about this sudden shift in focus was the way the knights were now being tested by women, not the other way around. It was as if the entire chivalric code had been turned on its head. Suddenly, the threat of rape wasn't a distant, shadowy possibility, it was a tangible, terrifying reality. Consider the siege of the Castle of Maidens, a fortress guarded by 7 knights who had succumbed to a perverse custom. They held captive any woman who dared to enter their domain. The scene was shockingly explicit, detailing the castle's depraved rituals and the brutal fate that awaited those who resisted. Hitwise passed a 7-year agon that these 7 brethren come into thy castle and Herberraud lodged with the lord of this castle, the narrator recounted, his voice devoid of sentimentality. And when they had espied the duke's daughter that was a full fair woman, then by their false coven agreement they made a bait debate betwixt himself, and the Duke of High's goodness wold have departed them, and there they slew him and High's eldest son. And then they took the maiden and the tresser of the castle, and so by great force they held all the nits of the country on dire gret servage and truage, thraldom robbage and pillage the poor common people. The details were gruesome, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of women in a world dominated by men. The knights weren't seeking to marry the women, they were seeking to destroy them, to reduce them to objects of lust and despair. And yet, the narrative subtly shifted, transforming the act of rape into a symbolic representation of spiritual corruption. The 7 knights were not merely villains, they were embodiments of the 7 deadly sins, each representing a different facet of human depravity. Their actions weren't simply acts of violence, they were manifestations of the devil's influence, designed to corrupt the souls of those who dared to approach the Grail. It was a jarring juxtaposition, a disturbing blend of graphic violence and allegorical symbolism. But it was precisely this ambiguity that made the Grail quest so unsettling, so profoundly unsettling. Tristram's story, a whirlwind of passion and betrayal, offered a different kind of darkness, a more familiar, almost decadent exploration of desire and obsession. He sought Isoud, a woman of extraordinary beauty and unwavering will, not for love but for glory, for the satisfaction of possessing the unattainable. He approached her with a cunning proposition, a carefully crafted bargain that exploited her desperation. Suddenly unavised, he declared, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light, "I wool that ye weet that I will have you a queen to lead here and to govern her whereas me list." Isoud, a woman who understood the precariousness of her position, agreed. She offered Palomides her promise, a simple, seemingly innocuous agreement, and he, in turn, demanded her as a prize. The scene was unsettling, a bizarre dance of power and manipulation. Palomides hadn't rescued Isoud, he'd seized her, reduced her to a pawn in his elaborate game. He'd become, in effect, her fifth possessor, a title that tasted faintly of ash in his mouth. But then Tristram intervened, rescuing Isoud from Palomides' clutches. His swift action wasn't driven by chivalry, it was driven by a desperate need to assert his own dominance, to prove that he was the one who held the power. And yet, the narrative subtly shifted, transforming Tristram's act of rescue into a demonstration of his love for Isoud. He hadn't sought to possess her, he'd sought to protect her, to shield her from the clutches of a ruthless and calculating adversary. The story of Isoud's abduction wasn't simply about rape, it was about the struggle for control, the desperate attempts to define one's own identity in a world dominated by power and manipulation. The entire Mort Arthur, with its shifting allegiances and its complex web of relationships, ultimately raises a disturbing question. Is chivalry ever truly about rescuing damsels, or simply rearranging power dynamics? Is it a code of honor or a carefully constructed facade designed to mask a darker, more primal instinct? Perhaps in the end, the only true victory lies not in possession, but in the ability to relinquish control. Was it ever about rescuing damsels, or simply rearranging power dynamics?